All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second session of People Matters 2022. Thank you so much to Eric for moderating our first session and David Kim from Jigbang for being a great guest on that first session. Hopefully, everybody will be joining from the main event. And once again, I'm Gordon Dudley. I will be moderating this second session. We have a fantastic panel discussion lined up for you around the topic of Korean market opportunities and trends for 2022 and beyond. We're going to be joined by, as you can see, three panelists who are with me for this session. So as people come into the room and start joining, we'll maybe just give it another minute before I formally introduce my guests, and we'll go into the main agenda. Thank you everybody for joining, and we'll begin very shortly. Okay. Absolutely. If you do have questions throughout this session, rather than the chat box, which can get a little bit busy, please click the Q&A button, put your question in there, and we'll be able to come to it in the Q&A towards the end of the session. This session is going to be a panel discussion for the most part, and we'll then break out into a Q&A towards the end. Okay, well, I think as more people will continue to join the session, we can get started because we have lots to talk about on this particular session. So first, let me introduce the panelists that I have with me for this session. First of all, Taewon who is the Country Director of Enterprise Ireland Korea Office. Thank you for joining, Taewon. Taewon was formerly the Director of Trade and Policy at the British Chamber of Commerce Korea, where he was advising companies on market entry into Korea. And so he brings a real wealth of experience from his former organizations in exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Secondly, Rod Rothwell has been in Korea for 25 years. And working in both business and academia. He has a very balanced view and will be able to bring us a counterpoint in today's discussion. Formerly with Samsung SDS, Rod has also set up his own business in Korea, which I think is an interesting thing to also look at given the topic today. He is also currently the business professor at George Mason University in Songdo, Incheon, and also the co-chair of the Korea Business Leaders Alliance. So very glad to have Rod joining us. And the third panelist is Meerin Cho. She is working in the Innovation and Growth team at the Korea International Trade Association, or KITA, as it's known. And she's mostly helping startups to connect with partners for business opportunities, engaging with startup founders, open innovation managers, and other kinds of global brands, VCs, and accelerators around the world to try to support developing those business leads. So I'm sure you will agree that we have a fantastic background of the three guests with us. Thank you very much for joining. And let me then ask my first question to Taewon. First of all, it would be good to just understand a little bit more about the role of Enterprise Ireland. But in addition to that, can you just give us some of your perspectives on right now, current status, Korean market opportunities as you see it?
Sure, Gordon, thanks for the kind introduction. And as Gordon introduced, my name is Taewon, and then I'm a country manager for Korea at the Enterprise Ireland. And Enterprise Ireland is the Irish government's innovation and trade promotion agency with more than 40 international offices globally. So I help Irish entrepreneurs and businesses to export to world markets. And my remit is to help the Irish company export to Korean market. So it's important that for me to continuously identify the local market and business trends, which is changing quite quickly in Korea. And then more importantly, to connect that identified opportunities with Irish companies by making introduction to Korean companies for discussions and also organizing trade events and etc. So I'm aware that, what's changing quickly in Korean market and then how we connect that opportunity. So in terms of the Korean economy, just put the context that Korean economy and Korean businesses industry grew from kind of leapfrogging, which is that mimicking already proven or developed technology, product and services, and importing to developing for the Korean market and exporting as well. So this is the leapfrogging, and then that was the Korea's developmental phase, and until recently. But in the past 10 or 20 years, that Korea has cemented the world leadership position in certain sectors like semiconductors, automotive, shipbuilding, and things like that. And then at that stage, you can't just keep copy and paste, but actually you do need to now develop innovative solutions to stay competitive and then to cement the world leadership position there. So that has prompted a paradigm shift from Korea's developmental, economic development stage. And now creativity and then innovation is ever more important than just mimicking what's already there in order to stay competitive. So what I see these days is that a lot of now the Korean large companies is open to collaborating with the external entities. Previously, the Korean large conglomerate will tend to do in-house themselves rather than opening up their ecosystem and they work together with external entities. But because of that paradigm change happening in Korea, that prompted a lot of Korean companies and especially large companies to work with international companies, the startups and small and large companies, to make sure that they continuously stay ahead of this innovative competition. So I think that also created another the situation where in the past in the 10 or years. Korea's startup industry has been quite vibrant, and I think that's because of that paradigm shift. Because the large companies are so complex and large, they are not necessarily able to catch up with all the rapidly changing trends and technology and innovation. But I think that's Korean startups are quickly able to respond to the changing trends or changing the market needs and things like that. So that's a kind of another, I think, emerging, market trend in Korea. So that's one thing. And another thing is that there's a more, probably same globally, but also there is a lot of emphasis on the ESG, which stands for environmental sustainability, and then environmentally. So in line with the Korean government's 2050 decarbonization. So a lot of companies at the moment that I'm speaking to, for example, Korean large companies and SMEs, they're actually looking for a lot of innovative solutions around the recycling or the waste to, recycling renewable energies and things like that. So I see that there's a quite strong emergence of Korean companies who are trying to capture the ESG as a business opportunity rather than business challenges, and then trying to stay ahead of it. But again, the Korean large company cannot do themselves, and that's why they're emphasizing and augmenting their external collaboration. So some Korean large company has created their corporate venture capital. So it's a fund within their large company, and then they're actively identifying the new technology and then they're investing, which never seen before, but that's happening in the Korean large companies. And so I think that's their way of responding to how stay ahead of the other players and competitors, and then that's one way to responding. And another trend is that large companies has created their startup within their large company, and if that startup goes well, then they tend to spin off as independent entities as well, and that's kind of quite remarkably changing trends happening in Korea. So maybe then that's the I summarize it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I mean, that is absolutely a great coverage of so many of the current trends that are happening right now. Some of the demands and the changes that's given us, I think, absolutely plenty to talk about. Let me then shift over to you, Meerin, to give your perspectives. Tell us a little bit about what you're involved in at KETA.
Actually, what I'm doing at KETA is exactly in line with what Mr. Just mentioned. So I'm working mainly on the side of innovation and supporting startups and startup founders and large enterprises. So let me just briefly explain what we're doing to support them and support them with business development. We actually started off our support with our program called Fortune 500 Connect, which is a program to provide connections for startups to connect with large enterprises for open innovation opportunities. So as Mr. Just mentioned, a lot of enterprises are opening their door to cooperating with other companies outside of Korea for open innovation. So we try to come into this picture to provide the right connections to help them find the right partners for business opportunities. But we actually found some inherent limitation in the way that we provide connections as part of our open innovation matching service, because mostly a lot of open innovation matching services are based on paper review. So a lot of large enterprises make decisions based on the review of applications submitted by startups. But this can actually have some limitation in a sense that even startups with great potential but cannot turn their ideas into great commercialized solutions or products do not have an opportunity to meet with the large enterprises in the first place. So realizing this limitation, we try to develop a new support model called POC model. So now we're deeply engaged in supporting the procedural steps for conducting POCs between startups and large enterprises. So we're now running a lot of POC programs in different regions of the world, like the USA and Europe. So what we do is that we provide some support, either financial or logistical support, by hiring a local PM project manager there in the specific regions where POCs are to be conducted, to help startups engage with the specific procedural steps to validate their technological commercial value. So if startups receive support from us in terms of POC execution, they can actually have a more chance of proving that their technology can bring commercial value to their large enterprise partners. And at the same time, large enterprises can have a better chance of making an informed decision based on real life validation data. Yes.
Thank you. Sorry, I thought you finished, please.
No, I just wanted to say this is kind of a brief summary of what we're doing.
No, that's great. Thank you. And that's why I think, I think we have a good mix on the panel today. Moving to you, Rod, I think it's great that we have someone who's also has a couple of hats, both public educational sector as well as private sector as a counterpoint. So yeah, can you give me some of your current perspectives on this topic?
Well, I think what's really interesting is, from what Meerin and Taewon have said, is that message has reached the outer world, has reached a global audience. And what we see at George Mason is, and I know some the podcast as well, is that there's now a generation of expats looking at Korea to either start up their own startup, to found their own startup in a real massive range, or engage in businesses that previously weren't even considered. So if you imagine 10 years ago, the average expat came to Korea, a professional expat came to Korea with the idea of getting a job in a large company. Gordon at Hyundai, me at Samsung, and people like that. And that was kind of a box that we went in. But now there are literally people getting off the plane every day who want to start up a crypto startup in Korea, or they want to start up an energy startup in Korea. And so that's really interesting that message has reached a global audience and is now pulling people in. And it's fascinating to me that I meet people. I spoke to somebody the other day who's literally looking at a waste energy company now. And that's really fascinating to me because he's basically trying to do it by himself. And I find that really interesting. On the other side of things, there seems to be Korean students are much more flexible about their aspirations after university. Whereas before, you probably had people who thought, okay, I'm going to go for one of the big guys and everything else is a discounted, that's the A grade job, that's the B grade job, that's the C grade job. But I don't see that anymore. I see people going, no, this is the kind of thing I want to do, and they're following those dreams. So from my perspective, they're the two trends that I see most commonly today that are new.
Sure. I mean, from a kind of consumer perspective, Korea definitely is on the radar more than ever before. There's a really good index, the so-called soft power index, which measures the kind of the soft power that a country has in terms of how well it is perceived by other countries, and Korea continues to rise up that ranking. One of the other rankings that Korea has recently been also very high on, of course, is some of the innovation rankings. I think the Bloomberg is one of the ones which it's actually been #1. And Taewon, you mentioned that about innovation and that kind of thing. Is there an aspect that is different about Korean innovation that you see, which is in a sense a kind of a competitive edge? I mean, one of the key trends, one of the key factors that puts Korea at the top of the Bloomberg index is from their R&D investment and patent filing, which of course is in some sense like a measurable output. But in terms of this innovative atmosphere, what is it that's maybe different about Korea to other potential markets?
I think, that's a good question, Gordon. And then I think innovation probably is important everywhere. But I think to maybe it might be useful to put a context here that Korea is located between Japan and then China, and oftentimes there is a kind of the phrase coming out of the newspaper, they're sandwiched between Japan and China. So China is obviously catching up quite quickly in terms of technology and the semiconductors and the shipbuilding and things like that, where Korea has a advantage, but probably there has been quite strong competition from China, and then Japan was more advanced in many technologies, so probably in certain areas not anymore. But again, Korea was in a situation between the Japan and China, so there was a lot of pressure, even more, in order to rather up the competitive, rather that the competition, in order to stay ahead of the competition, that the innovation became very important. So I think that policymakers, industry, business leaders all understands the importance of actually being innovative in order to globally competitive, because a lot of Korea is very export-oriented economy. So you are basically competing, Samsung's TV is competing with a Sony, and then Chinese TV and other, Panasonic and this kind of international players. So I think you are directly feeling the impacts of the global competition. And I think the innovation was particularly important. I think one aspect is the Korean government is still quite deeply involved in promoting the innovation. So probably the same for other countries, but I think Korean government is particularly so. So I know that KOCHER, which is Korea's trade promotion agency, is also helping a lot of SMEs to go digital and then augment their innovation capabilities. And then there's a number of different initiatives coming out of the different Korean government agencies, whether it's Ministry of Science, Ministry of Transportation for e-mobility, and there's a lot of emphasis coming from the government and quite supportive of a policy, environmental situation for the companies to pursue innovation there. there. And then another thing is the Korea's education system that, I think Korea's education system, maybe some people say that it was, not fully prepared for the creative economy, but still that the flexibility, I think flexibility is found in everywhere in Korea. And I think the education is one of the things that the flexibility to quickly tailor towards more suited for the economy where the creativity and innovation is emphasized, and that's probably another facets of Korea's innovative economy. And I know that Rod can talk about more on the education side, but that's I see that maybe one unique characteristics of Korea's innovation economy. So yeah, I think that's it.
And is that similar to what you see, Meerin, with KETA? And obviously, as one of the kind of promotion type of areas, is that also similar to how you kind of present and really put Korea forward in that way?
Yes, actually, I completely agree with what Mr. Just said. And I can add several points of insight here. So I think probably it's just in line with what he already said, but education. So we are very well reputed for highly qualified talents here in Korea. So it's actually one of the reasons why a lot of foreign companies are trying to enter the Korean market to acquire good talents and also cooperate with them to create really creative products and solutions. So I think that's one of the factors. And the second one is ample support from the government. That's really true. It's actually pointed out as one of the things that kind of hinder the development of startups in some ways, to some extent, because it actually creates a lot of startups who are just sustaining themselves on the support of government money, not without actually trying to develop further and expand their businesses globally on their own. But at the same time, these opportunities that are enabled by the government support are something that are really helping startups with limited resources to develop something that they could have not developed without the money. Actually, we cooperated with a Silicon Valley consulting firm last year called the Mind the Bridge to study the Korean innovation ecosystem. And according to the report, there are about 52 global enterprises that are operating 59 open innovation teams here in Korea. And for the past 5 years, we have a lot more open innovation teams or kind of small side investment entities that have been established in Korea. This is actually quite a good change from what we had witnessed in the early 20s, in 2000s, when the R&D labs was the only type of open innovation team in Korea. But then we have a lot of small and medium and big sized investing firms in the form of CVCs or other kind of R&D labs, or also just a small sized open innovation team dedicated to finding technologies in Korea.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've both touched on some of the key points there. I mean, I've been in Korea for 12 years now, and there was literally no startup ecosystem even 12 years ago. There was a big push for with a creative economy strategy, and now Korea is in all the headlines for the the innovative startups. We've seen some with phenomenal success. I think per capita Korea is now really high in terms of unicorns. So if we're talking about the real success stories of startups, then Korea is really moving that. And I think that speed element is such a critical part of innovation, and speed has been a cornerstone of Korea's development from the very start, and I think it has continued into this particular area. And I think then you also touched about flexibility. Of course, you can be as fast as you like, but if you're not reacting and adapting to the current trends, then that's where speed comes to nothing, right? It achieves nothing in the end. In terms of where Korea was previously with such a dominance of large companies, and now this kind of flourishing startup ecosystem, it's very interesting to hear you mention about this startup within a large company. Maybe from the outside we might think, how is that going to really help a startup be the kind of the fast-moving, dynamic place to get to market? Can you tell us a bit more about that, Taewon, in terms of maybe you have some examples of those? Are these startups really starting within large companies, or are they being acquired at an early stage by large companies? I've not heard of other countries with this kind of approach, so I'm interested to hear more about that.
Sure. So I was having a coffee with one of the Korea's fourth largest conglomerate, one of the affiliates of the Hyundai the other day, and then they recently created a new business development division. And I was telling them why your company is doing that, and he was telling me that previously the growth model was that copy and paste, or kind of just mimicking something. But again, pretty in conjunction with the Korean economy's dominance, that you can't do that anymore. And then they are actively looking for something new, new technology for commercial viability in Korean market, things like that. But one thing he told me that interesting was that if you're mimicking something, there's no room for failure. So there's no culture of accepting if you try something and if you fail, then you're out. So that kind of created less flexibility within the large company to try something new. That's why they needed to, rather than change the culture, maybe, which takes a lot of time, but then obviously the business trend doesn't wait for you until you change your culture. So what a lot of companies trying to do at the moment is they're creating their mini units, whether it's a new divisions or not as a new entity, but new divisions or kind of the new startup elements. And then, for example, Samsung Electronics actually gave a couple of months of time for the employee who wished to pursue the startup company. And then if the startup company becomes successful, then they either spin out or Samsung actually owns the IP there, things like that. So I think these are kind of the new movement, but I think that's also embedded with our Korean culture that no failure was accepted. But now gradually moving towards the culture where you can try something new and then it's okay that if it doesn't go well. But as an interim situation, I think it seems like a lot of companies are responding by creating their startup units or let the other employees to do something new within the new environmental situation. And then, probably that unit is smaller and more agile and then more flexible and responding quickly to the changing trends and things like that. So probably this is the another kind of initiative that many actually large company is pursuing at the moment. So, and in conjunction with a corporate venture capital, where actually startup needs a funding in order to grow. But initially, you do need to, you might have the ideas, and then maybe the employee of the Hyundai might have some ideas from his own daily job, and then he wants to do something new. And there's a program. Significance of this is that they let that this employee to take advantage of the new program that they created and then try something new. Under the existing structure, probably it might be challenging for them to do it. But now, if under this new kind of program, they can do something that they think has a potential to grow. And then if this grows until a certain stage, then there's a funding available, from this company. So you need a lot of elements in order to grow the startup. But first idea and implementation, and you do something with the existing resources. And then if it's proceeding to something new or something more bigger than what they expected, then, there's investment to go the more commercially, widespread. So I think there's an opportunity. One sense, the opportunity for the Western or the international company is that now the Korean large companies, whether their creation of the CVC or the corporate venture capital, fund, they are now investing quite actively with innovative, proven technology. Obviously, they will go through a lot of thorough validation of the technology, but once they are validated, then there's a funding available. And plus, Korean large company has their international offices globally, or they have suppliers and they have partners, and actually it becomes the network for applying this proven developed technology into this investor and as a potential business partner to apply this tech to globally there. So I think this is early to mid stage of the development of this kind of the new trends, and probably this might accelerate over time. But I think this is clearly emerging trend and mid to long term. And then I think international company wishing to work with this company needed to think as a strategically how they want to approach, and what kind of funds, what are they investing, what are they looking for, and how are we going to apply our technology to fit into these changing trends. So I think that's one tip there.
Yeah, I think that's some great points that in some sense you're getting the best of both opportunities in that critical early stage, which can be, we all know the statistics of how many startups fail in the early stages, right? And so I think any way which can support and foster those early stages, especially with international collaboration, could be even great. Rod, do you want to comment on this?
Well, yeah, I guess from two examples, just to give it a little bit of context. So when Lee Hae-jin came up with his idea of a native search engine for Korea, he was in Samsung Electronics, and he took his idea to his boss. And he said, hey, look, I've come up with this really good idea. And they said, no, thank you. And so he said, no, thank you. And he went away and he created Naver. All right, so there's a feeling inside the major conglomerates of, hey, look, we could have added, like I'm just looking at it now, $5.3 trillion every year to our bottom line if we had just said, yeah, that's a great idea, let's keep Lee Hae-jin in the company and develop it. So they do have a bit of scarring there. And that was one of the impetus, and that's 23 years ago now that came through. In SDS, there is, as Taewon said, there's two parts of SDS devoted to this technology transfer. There's one part which is constantly searching the globe for technology that they can bring in to either systems integration or logistics, or even more next generation stuff like crypto and blockchain and things like that. So they've got those feelers all the time. And then like Taewon said, there's also inside companies like SDS opportunities that if a project organically emerges, then that team will be given the opportunity to hive off for 18 months and 2 months and come up with a POC. And probably the most successful example of that is the S-Patch, which is a 5G enabled health monitoring device, which is fantastic. It allows a doctor to know a patient's heart rhythms out of the hospital. And so they don't have to come into the hospital to get a health checkup. All they have to do is turn on their phone. So it's a fantastic device. And firefighting departments can use it to monitor firefighters when they're fighting a fire, to say who's tired, who needs to come out. Police departments can do the same. And the S-Patch was actually a joint team of outsiders coming into SDS, and also the internal medical team looking at this technology of 5G. So it was a really good example of internal-external collaboration. And so what Taewon said, I can agree with, and I've seen face-to-face is happening inside the larger conglomerates, and is often the most profitable parts of their business.
Absolutely. I think that, you know, the title of our conference is People Matters. So I want to turn a little bit more to the HRM aspect of this session. And, you know, we've already talked about how education is one of the absolute key factors for Korea, and even from an innovative perspective, actually, the very high level of education continues to be one of the advantages. When it comes to kind of like relative ease of doing business, shall we say? Now there is, of course, a ranking for that as well. And I keep coming back to the rankings, which puts Korea, I think, at something like 5th, if I'm not mistaken, at the ease of doing business. And that's because when it comes to literally establishing in Korea, it's incredibly quick, it's incredibly cheap, and the actual the requirements are relatively small on a relatively good infrastructure allowing to that. But sometimes there can be a bit of a criticism or in some sense a reluctance because of the kind of difficulty of doing business when it comes to hiring and firing, for example, and also with a relatively kind of static workforce, not so mobile, and even very geographically concentrated in the Seoul greater region. It's something that we, you know, RDI come up against. Some of our clients trying to hire talents outside of Seoul. You know, that's can be a real struggle, and also when it comes to some kind of concerns about the hiring and firing, they understand that it's very difficult to do that. Can you give some kind of perspectives on that in terms of it being both at the same time a competitive advantage and disadvantage?
Is that for me?
Sure.
I think you're right that the flexibility, the inflexibility in the labour markets is the thing that I hear most people talk of as the biggest difficulty in doing business in Korea. That after 90 days, you have to make a really big commitment about whether you're keeping this person or not. And for me, what I see is firms are having a halfway bet and putting that person into the freelancer category or the gig economy. So I see this splintering a lot in Korea right now of it's still 70 or 80% of the regular employee markets, but a really growing gig economy and freelancer market, which is fine, I think, except if it happens that people get put in that bucket and then can't make the bridge across to the regular employee market, I think that becomes problematic.
Okay. Meerin, for startups, how is it for startups? Do they have to have a local partner to be able to really get going, or can they do it by themselves? And if so, is that complicated, or are there good systems and infrastructure for doing that?
I think it's quite good timing for me to touch upon this issue because we have recently surveyed about 300 startups on the topic of do you have any difficulties finding foreigners for your companies?
300
yes.
startups in Korea or 300 startups globally?
In Korea, both in Korea and globally. So there are some of the startups who are only established in Korea, but there are also startups who are trying to expand globally or already have offices there in other countries. And then we got some answers from them, and then most of them, like the number one answer that they provided to us, the most difficult part of finding foreigners here is that they have like language and cultural barriers. And even though, because a majority of their team members are composed of Koreans who can speak fluent English, but at the same time have some difficulty understanding exactly what other foreigner team members are trying to express. So actually, and there are actually a very obvious difference in terms of culture, because in terms of work culture, here in Korea, as you might know, that we're actually working like sometimes 24/7 when there is some need, to do something. But then a lot of like team members in other countries who are trying to connect with Korea for resolving any business issues, they have really a lot of like hard time because of the huge time difference and also some cultural mindsets that are different. Because sometimes it's actually what a lot of Korean startups say. So this is not like the objective answer that I can give, but a lot of them say that like in Korea, even though there's like the 52 hours business hours regulation here, but still a lot of startups have to work outside of business hours in order to do something urgently. But this is not always the case in other countries. And this is actually one of the reasons why it is kind of a lot of startup founders are hesitant about hiring foreigners, but at the same, yeah, that's actually the #1 answer. And actually, I wish I could actually, bring the sheet of like the answers that I collected from the startups here with me, but I don't have that information right now, but I can actually share the information later if you want. So if you give me an email or something for the survey, results, I'm more than happy to share that with you.
Sure, thank you. And maybe also some participants can kind of reach out to you directly through the expo, which is going to be coming up right after this session. Yeah, I mean, I think you both mentioned some key parts there. I do think one of the other topics that was mentioned was about resilience, and I think resilience when it comes to entering into a market for the first time, whether you are a startup or a large organization, resilience is almost the #1 requirement, right? And so I think that whether it is we're talking about the characteristics of Korea and the labor force, which have that in abundance, or it is for those looking to come into Korea who need that. I think that if I speak from my personal experience, I came to Korea initially and did my MBA. That was in order to give myself a soft landing into Korea. It was from the UK, pretty much inherently difficult to get a job straight into Korea. And so I think that's quite a euphemism for how I feel we should always approach doing work in foreign companies, is that don't expect too much too soon, right? You have to get to know the local environment, the way of the business environment, the way of doing business in that area in order to be able to go quickly. And I have seen some startups, they hear about the speed of Korea and consequently their expectations go really high, and then realize, well, yes, speed in some ways, but reality can be a bit of a different area. I also want to talk a little bit about the way in which the Korean economy, we've been mostly talking about startups, but of course, Korea is still dominated by large conglomerates. And in terms of markets that are essentially 2 or 3 company dominated markets, and then that as an opportunity to disrupt and come in. Does the Korean corporate landscape make it more difficult because of that structure, or is it in fact that very nature of that dominance is an opportunity for entrants to come in? What do you think about that? Maybe Taewon.
I think there's both. So if you look at the Korean economy, that there's a large conglomerate. So for example, the Hyundai or Samsung, and then they have about another 70 different affiliates or subsidiary. And then around one subsidiary, for example, in automotive, that there's about 700 sub-suppliers as an ecosystem there. So there's a large company there, and then there's SMEs, about a small but has a quite strong capability in terms of supplying into the Hyundai. So when Hyundai Motor set up their operation or a manufacturing facility in Alabama and Georgia, actually one of the requirements is that their suppliers set up their operation in US as well, surrounding their factories. So there's a smooth supply of the key elements of their car there. So that's the one nature. I think to your questions about whether it's opportunity or challenges for the international company wanting to come to the Korean market, I think it's both that, in a sense that challenge, because that if this is something that they see the ideas and it's not IP protected, and then, if this is something that Korean company, a large conglomerate can emulate quite quickly, utilizing their existing network and then ability to develop something quite quick, then it becomes a challenge, I think. So I think in that sense that it's important for the international company approach with well-protected IPs, and that there's some homework for these companies to do before approaching or working with a Korean company. And also opportunity, because as I explained in my earlier the comments, that there's a more appetite and there's a more systematic changes within the Korean large companies, that this is because all the competition is so changing quickly, rapidly, and time-wise, they can't do everything themselves alone, and therefore there's a lot of the recognition at the senior management level that this is something that they have to switch their the operating model to work with external players, not in a hostile way but in a collaborative way. So I know that a few years ago that open innovation was kind of the words everywhere. You can hear from the LG setting up their open innovation team and Samsung, but I think that now has evolved into another level where actually they are creating the corporate venture capital within their company, creating the situation or the kind of setting where employee can take their ideas into, commercially. And a lot of the changes happening at the moment in the support of the government policy like KITA and the Co-Chair. So I think in that sense, I think it's opportunity. But I think one thing that the Meerin and Rod said was that one of the challenges that actually finding the human workforce who has a language capability plus their expertise. And in my job and the previous job that I helped with the Western company to recruit for their local presence here. And then one challenge clearly to those companies was that they couldn't find a qualified expertise or knowledge with the language capability. And it's not simply the English, but actually who understands the nuance of the language, and also more in the communication capability, a more broad sense that ability to communicate in different languages as well. So that's something to note. But yeah, that's it. That's my points here.
Well, Taewon, I think you've done this unconsciously, but you have absolutely teed up the opportunity for me to say that is exactly what we at RDI are helping companies with when they are coming into Korea. So I think it was subconscious, but thank you so much. I mean, literally, companies coming into Korea trying to grow their operations is one of the key areas of where we're working with exactly that. It's not just about bilingual, it's about also that full range of human skills to be able to work with cultures and other countries in different kind of communication styles with that flexibility. And that's definitely where we see a strong demand, because still large Korean companies, hiring domestically, in a certain with a certain way, and of course foreign entities coming into Korea, or indeed smaller companies and startups growing, also are looking for very much a different kind of person. I think that with the taking a quick look at the time, we should maybe go into a couple of Q&As, and I think actually it's nice segue from what we've just talked about there, because there was a question around, do we see a mindset change when it comes to Korean companies in terms of newer generations having different expectations? Maybe I can come to Rod first, to you on that one.
Yeah, I definitely say yes. And I'd say in two different ways. As I mentioned before, previously, there was a view from university graduates that I wanted to get, you know, the pinnacle job was working for semiconductor in Samsung Electronics, and everything was a very straight discount from that in the business world. And what I see now really comes down to diversity, where people feel a lot more confident in actually finding out what they're good at, whether it's through online surveys or career counseling or several internships before making an actual career decision. And, you know, these kids making these decisions are doing it with a lot more information, and I think they're making much better decisions. So diversity in that way. The second thing I think we're feeling is that our senior students are openly talking about different careers. You know, the first job, the second job, the third job, and, you know, the pivots that might happen, and not thinking of that as a bad thing. Whereas again, previous generations, they assumed that they'd be able to push the whole way through till they retire in the one organization. The other thing that I think is really interesting for young people is this idea of work and life balance becoming really central to their decision to join an organization or not. So, you know, the questions that our students ask in interviews are, you know, how many hueshicks do I have to go to a week or a month? How often am I expected to do overtime? How often will I be expected to travel? Whereas before, you know, a young university graduate was just supposed to be so grateful for an opportunity that he would do whatever was told. But now there's an expectation of, no, wait a second. I have this life outside work. So for me, diversity of choice and intelligence of choice is one thing that I see our strong people doing. And the second one would be this understanding that work is now just a part of life rather than the determining factor.
I think there's some great points there. Would anybody else like to comment on that? If not, we can go on with some other questions. I think you know, there was a really good question here about the Korean elite universities dominating the top talents. You know, I mentioned earlier about Seoul being such a magnet for all the top talents across the whole of the country, and how to advise companies to go beyond that, to get visibility of other talents who are not just there. You know, I come across that all the time. I get requests from companies that they would like to have somebody from Sky, a certain age, you know, within a 5-year age gap, male or female only, and you know, these are the only kind of candidates that they're willing to look at. And I think if they are very extreme and absolutely adamant about that, then that's not a company that I'm going to work with. So I let them go their own way and won't work with them. If, however, they actually are willing to have a bit of a dialogue around that, then what we often do is try to provide candidates who are exactly the best fit for the job, not necessarily those universities. And actually, you know, if you're dealing with you know, in professional recruitment, the degree, the more experience you have, the less and less important the degree is. And so I do see it becoming less of an important criteria. And so we try to just present a diverse shortlist of candidates, some who might be older, might be younger, might, you know, might even not be in Seoul but want to relocate. I think all of these aspects of diversity, of which there are many parts, which we'll also talk about in a further session of People Matters, are important. And I think there is some change, but it is slow. And definitely we're trying to do our part in that aspect as well. Would anyone like to comment on their kind of personal experiences around that?
I think foreign companies have to be made aware of how people get into Sky universities. And people get into Sky universities by being very good at doing exams. You know, that's the #1 skill to get into Sky University. And to get through that process again, you know, so if they're after a book smart, diligent person, then okay, that's a great pathway. But the opportunities once you're in that stream to actually grow yourself and get some transferable skills is really limited. And I think that schools that have a little bit more, you know, if I was going to recruit a university graduate, I'd be looking for those universities that have a strong industry outreach and have a lot of programs to help their students get intern experience in their 3rd year and their 4th year. So they're the kinds of things that I'd be advising as well.
All right. I want to, before this session wraps up, take that future view and get each of your perspectives on, based on some of the trends that we've discussed, some of the things that we see emerging. Where do we see things going in the future? What's going to kind of change? We also, of course, have a significant presidential election happening, which is always a step change in the Korean economy and society when that happens. And so, you know, probably through this year, we will see some of those new changes coming in. You know, even within the last 2 years of the pandemic status, we've seen certain industries really booming. We've seen certain sectors of the economy doing better than others. Extrapolating that forward into a kind of future horizon, what do we, you know, what are going to be some of the continuing, you know, major trends when it comes to the Korean market? Maybe I'll come to Taewon first.
Yep, good. So obviously we have the president's election coming in March this year, and then depending on who wins, obviously it will bring some impact as well. So for example, People Power's candidate, the Sung Yoon, has indicated that actually he relaxed the environmental or the sustainability clauses for the SMEs, and probably the opposition part, not the opposition, but the leading, party's candidate has a different position on that. So obviously it will impact, then, the regulations, the policy, which then in return, the company will have to deploy or develop a different strategy in response to these regulations. But I think in the long term, I don't think it will change. Over and over again, I think the importance of I think 죄송한데 나중에 해주시겠어요? 지금 뒤에 sorry, yeah, so my door is not locked, so I think the innovation will be more important. I think and a lot of companies will have to continuously invest and then work to improve their innovation element. So I expect that there's more, I think, from the open innovation to the corporate venture capital and then startup within the company. And then probably there's other development might be happening. And, there might be a lot of the strategies there, but maybe it can be the, merger and acquisition and open collaboration and all sorts of the, the initiative can come out of this, the Korean company. But again, I think the elements about innovation will never, decrease, and then there is continuously their initiative and investment and the initiative to augment their, innovative elements of their company. But one thing that I want to mention is that for international company or Western company or from the other outside of Korea, that it might be really challenging to approach the Korean conglomerate because it's quite complex and it's large, and then they don't know actually who to contact, and then sometimes the Korean companies are quite inward rather than outward bound, so especially for the foreigners. So this might be quite daunting for the Western company to pitch or approach somebody there, and but I think this is also quite gradually changing. For example, the KT Korea Telecom a few days ago, they announced that they are now developing the system where all the pitching company can come to their website and then they can register their technology, and then they will evaluate this new pitching there. And before, the KT was approached by their senior management or someone else, so there's no way of tracking down what they've been offered and then what they've been rejected and what they accepted. But now I think a lot of companies now applying the way of systematically managing that kind of and opening up their platform. So maybe that's one thing to note.
Great example. Thank you, Taewon. Rod, over to you.
I guess the number one thing that I see is Web 3.0. That's the thing that companies seem most interested in talking about, and most people in companies interested in about. So how is e-commerce going to merge with the gaming industry? When we realize that the Korean gaming industry is literally 100 times bigger than the K-pop industry, it's a real part of the economy and that's driving and creating jobs. So how are cryptocurrencies and NFTs going to continue with that one aspect of Web 3.0? And the other major thing that I look at is going back to this idea of regular versus irregular employment. I'm seeing a lot of virtual companies being set up now, which is another version of outsourcing, I guess, in a way, that people will stay at home and do the work from home on a mission by mission basis, rather than actually having a contract with the company. So I'm going to see more virtual companies acting as outsourcing and a lot more impact of 3.0.
Thank you. Some great points. Meerin.
I see a lot of startups are nowadays are pursuing globalization in the first place, because even from the initial stage of establishing their business. So they set up their business either outside of in countries outside of Korea in the first place, or settle themselves there and then return back to Korea later after they grew up enough. I think these growing global companies are some of the major trends, especially in the startup culture. And I think this can be a good sign, because they can once they return back to Korea, they can bring some of the technologies that were not really fully developed or not really familiar with a lot of consumers here in Korea.
That's also a great point. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and experiences. We are unfortunately already out of time. Often when we have these kind of discussions, time does just run away, and I'm sure that we could continue speaking about the other opportunities of the Korean market. First of all, thank you so much to my guest panelists for being with us in this session. Also to all of the attendees for joining this session. Thank you for being with us, and to the people who've asked questions. Also really appreciate that.